They sent the overweight girl to clean his barn as a joke, but the rancher refused to let her go. The rancher refused to let her go. The morning Clara left the boarding house, someone had scribbled a dare beneath the job notice. Make him laugh? This was a joke built to bite. The girls stacked cruelty like kindling, their laughter sharp, sure the rancher would spit her out the moment he saw her. Clara gripped the paper like a talisman, palms slick, wondering which humiliation would come first, the cold, the shove, the sneer, or something worse that had teeth you could not see until it bit. At the town's edge, the Thornton place brooded behind pines, its silhouette knuckled, the barn door yawning like a secret. Elias Thornton did not hire for manners. Dusty Creek said he hired for labor that did not complain. Stories whispered of a man who kept his anger behind a locked door. What the girls ignored was how rumors often hid surprises. On the road, Clara pictured hands that might push or hands that might steady. She pictured a single gesture that could unmake every joke. She thought of the drawer where she hid a letter scented faintly of lavender and courage, and prayed her feet would carry her past gossip towards something kinder than the town expected. As she stepped through the gate, a raven startled from a post, and the world seemed to hold its breath. In that hush another question rose: who would be braver, the girl everyone mocked, or the man who could decide her fate with one look? Either answer would split a life, and the truth waiting in the barn promised to be stranger than anyone guessed. She had nothing to lose but the shame that tethered her, yet inside her something fierce stirred, an odd mix of fear and a stubborn hunger for a place that would call her whole. The barn door breathed, waiting and small hope. Clara trudged for an hour along a rutted lane that cut through winter fields, shoulders hunched against wind tasting of iron and distant smoke. Her dress clung damply, threadbare at the cuffs, where years of mending had left pale seams. Beneath the hem her boots left dark prints that faded toward the horizon. The Thornton place rose ahead like a patch of industry in a quiet country, fence rails weathered to pewter, a line of posts leaning as if in private council, and a barn that held its own shadow. She paused at the gate, hand gripping iron that bit cold through the glove, listening for voices to confirm a prank. Instead came the measured report of hammer blows, each impact sending a slight shiver through earth and timber. Elias Thornton worked with a straight, broad back. His labor announced him more than his reputation. He settled grievances with force. Men said and broke tools when words failed. When he noticed her, she was rooted at the gate, an awkward silhouette wrapped in reluctance. His gaze ran over her quickly, like a man assessing a load he might accept or discard. A nod, a tilt of his head, then a motion toward an old broom propped near the threshold. No welcome, no sneer, only a curt directive. Work, don't talk, he said, voice flat as weathered metal. The command could have been cruel, but it bore a different economy, an expectation that labor, not backbiting, would settle a morning. The barn exhaled history as dust. Light sliced through gaps in boards into columns where moats hung like suspended seed. Straw lay in swathes, a disordered architecture of former seasons. A broken harness lay tangled near a trough like a defeated ribbon. The loft sagged under winter stores. Ropes drooped with patient gravity. As Clara drew the broom, she found the place kept its own rhythm. The scrape of bristles, the sigh of loose nails settling, the distant stamp of hooves. Her work became choreography without an audience. She swept the corridors of feed, shoved pitchforks back into their racks, gathered coils of rope, and eased them into tidy loops. Each inhale scorched her throat with dust, each exhale fogged and vanished. Sawdust traced the hem of her dress as if a shy hand attempted camouflage. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned to preserve small things. Each corrected sweep erased a fragment of chaos. Outside, Elias continued his steady work, sparks of flaked paint and splintered wood, catching the morning light. He set posts in frozen earth with precision that bordered on ritual. Once he glanced across his shoulder and his eyes registered endurance rather than novelty. Over time that appraisal softened into something like acknowledgement. He was a man shaped by weather and obligation, quick to anger yet not given to idle cruelty when work mattered. Clara's resolve was quiet, subterranean. Necessity and a half-remembered fierceness fed it. She had learned to place small bets against humiliation and win them in ways unseen at the boarding house. Each sweep returned a modest prize, a clear path between feed bins, a combed stack of hay, a row of tools hung with honest spacing. The barn brightened in increments. Sunlight found clean surfaces and made them true. The loft ladder, once a crooked hazard, now leans steady and safe. At midday, Elias set a tin cup of water near a pile of straightened harnesses. The gesture was small yet heavy with consequence. Clara accepted it with both hands, tasting cold metal in relief. The sound of his boots receding carried a steadiness she could count on. There was no patient praise. Instead, the barn offered order and results that required no explanation. Men in Dusty Creek traded rumors to stay warm, but here diligence wrote its own ledger. She noticed details while using her hands to avoid other thoughts. A nail hammered askew that had once nicked a horse's hide, a faded token tucked into a beam, browned and worn by time, and the exact scent of tack oil mingled with old grass. These observations accumulated into a geometry of place that was neither hostile nor tender. It simply existed with the blunt integrity of valuable things. Clara's palms, reddened and raw at the knuckles, learned the language of tools and how minor corrections preserved ease and safety. By the afternoon the barn had shown a visible change. Walkways cleared, a wheelbarrow freed from a thicket of rope, feed bins stacked with purpose. Elias paused in the doorway and let out a grunt that approximated approval. His face did not soften much, but permission hummed in the air. His glance carried a private tally of effort. The town might have sent her as a joke, but on these boards the ledger read differently. She had come expecting scorn and discovered instead, measure. As twilight edged the sky, the barn settled into a quiet populated by small domestic sounds. The rustle of straw, the distant clank of a gate, horses turning in stalls. Clara perched on a bale, palms aching, and allowed the silence to steady her. Not triumph, but a slow practical satisfaction crept in. The work spoke back in the only currency this place honored. She thought of the boarding house's thin laughter and felt it shrink under the weight of this day's labor. Elias moved toward a loose hinge and tightened it with practiced hand. He did not speak much. His work shaped his phrases into single measure. Yet when he finally offered, not as comfort but as fact, "Not bad," the words landed with a gravity that made her chest unclench. No cheers, no parade, only the honest punctuation of someone who recognized what had been accomplished. That night, Clara slept in a corner of the barn bedchamber, under a blanket that smelled faintly of horsehair and old sun. She had kept her back straight during the day, and in the quiet she let the memory of measured hammer blows and ordered aisles settle into her bones. The joke that sent her here remained a rumor on the road, but on this floor she had traded humiliation for task, laughter for a tally that she could mark with her own hands. Tomorrow the ledger would open again. Inside her chest a new measurement began to take root, not the thin arithmetic of humiliation but a patient accounting of small victories. She catalogued them like coins, a broom stroke leaving a clean lane, a rope loop tied with steady fingers, a bale stacked square. Each success trimmed the margin of shame until it became manageable. She pictured mornings when she could rise without tasting the boarding house's mockery, and sleep without counting jeers. A private inventory was built where rumor could not reach, and with each entry the old noise lost its power. She imagined answering the town's careless talk with only her hands and the plain evidence they produced. Tomorrow would demand more. Clara rose before dawn with a small, private determination that had been hammered thin by years of jeers. She wrapped her shawl and set out across frost-rimed fields. The road a ribbon of gray that led to work she did not choose but could not refuse. The Thornton barn brooded as she approached rails, silvered by cold and rooflines cut sharp against a pale sky. Inside, lights slanted through gaps, dust held in columns, making the air itself a thing to sweep. She took a broom and began where disorder was thickest, moving in long patient strokes that gathered straw into sensible piles. Each sweep demanded repetition and patience, and her hands learned the rhythm quickly. Blisters raised like small moons on palms that had known other labors. Dust burned at her eyes and lodged at the back of her throat, but she kept going, setting one task against the next as if paying off a debt. The barn answered in small currencies. A cleared aisle, a stack of tools hung square, a loft ladder set true. Motion erased the edges of chaos until the place began to hold together. Elias watched with a restraint that felt like a test. He had the look of a man who measured endurance by results rather than feeling. His jaw was an instrument trained to bite back speech. Once during a pause in his own work he set a tin cup of water down near her boots. The act was spare, nearly indifferent, and yet it landed with weight. Clara took the cup, hands trembling slightly from exertion, and drank the cold as if it were both an apology and an acknowledgement. For a moment, the barn held only the sound of her breath, and the faint clink of metal. She tended to hay with a precision that felt like contrition translated into craft. Bales that had been haphazardly arranged became neat, with corners tucked and spaces cleared to allow for safe passage. The loft, previously a chaos of old ropes and forgotten sacks, began to reclaim its shape. A ladder leaned true where it had hung at a precarious angle before. Each corrected imperfection seemed to rebuke the rumor that had dragged her here. Labor produced evidence that words could not deny. Pain threaded through the day like a steady needle. Her fingers numbed where cold met friction. Her forearms burned with repeated lifts. When a heavy bale shifted and threatened to topple, she pivoted and steadied it with an instinct born of necessity. Feeling the strain creep up through her shoulder and spine, she swallowed the impulse to groan, letting discomfort remain private. This work demanded a currency she could pay: plain endurance. By mid-afternoon the light made the instruments honest. Saw blades and hammerheads caught the sun and refused to hide. Clara took inventory in silence, marking small victories. A wheelbarrow freed from a tangle of rope, a feed bin scrubbed, bridles cleaned and returned to their hooks. Each task completed rearranged the barn's argument. Where laughter had once been the ledger, a new tally stood in its place, and it favored competence. Once a saloon man rode up with a leer aimed like a thrown knife. His horse snorted for mischief. He meant his words to be a test, to see whether she would answer with shame or sputter. Elias met him without fanfare, and without spectacle, his presence enough to unmake the man's swagger. The rider left with his challenge unspent, and Clara felt the moment as a tightening in her chest that eased because someone else had named the boundary for her. Dust claustrophobically invaded her breath, so she paused to wipe sweat and grit from her face. A stable cat wound around her ankles and nudged at her palm, indifferent and trusting. She chuckled, the sound a stranger to her own ears, and felt steady. Tending to small things became a way to measure time. The barn's inhabitants, mice, crows, a patient mare, accepted the new order without commentary. Their indifference was permission. Elias did not offer praise often, yet when he observed, his look held a tilted consideration that softened into grudging respect. At one point he grunted, "Not bad," and the phrase landed like currency, small, exact and weighty in a place that tracked value by result. She felt it settle somewhere in her chest, the way a ledger entry settles into a margin and becomes a record. The afternoon brought a sudden challenge. A rain front threatened, and the chill would turn to ice if feed and tarps were neglected. Clara moved with urgent purpose, hauling canvas, fastening ropes and sealing cracks against the coming wet. Her hands worked with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed endurance in private and now deployed it publicly. The barn responded, doors closing secure, bins sheltered, a line of tarps set like shields. She felt a sense of satisfaction in that readiness. The weather would not catch them unprepared. Through the day she endured small humiliations that arrived like pebbles. A furtive giggle, a sideways glance, but they struck less sharply because action had replaced waiting. Where before the boarding house's laughter had grown teeth, here it found itself outmatched by evidence. Her work spoke in a language that insult could not readily translate. Bruises measured in blisters were private proof of effort. As shadows lengthened and the day's final tasks were completed, she allowed herself to check the barn from end to end. Aisles cleared, harnesses aligned, a path to the loft safe and bright. The change was visible and not merely a feeling. Tools rested where they could be found, and the loft's weight seemed eased by order. Her arms ached and the blisters burned, but satisfaction moved through her with the steadiness of a tide. Before dusk, Elias approached with slow, unornamented steps. He did not frame his remarks in praise or pity. He had neither inclination nor time. He made room and let the work speak for itself. His earlier tin cup remained a simple symbol of what kindness looked like here. Small, functional, utterly practical. When he finally allowed the words, they were minimal and precise. The phrase was a tally, a blunt acknowledgement that carried with it a weight Clara hadn't expected. She thought of the boarding house bed she might have lost, and the drawer where she kept 2 faded letters. Those small losses sharpened resolve into a tool. Evening light gilded the barn's dust and made a quiet promise that effort counted, that the tally was hers to keep. The knowledge settled like a warm coal beneath her ribs, steady and improbable, and worth guarding. The CTA whispered at the edge of the day's quiet. Ever worked through pain to prove someone wrong? Share your moment below. Clara caught her breath, feeling a flicker of pride. Gossip slid through Dusty Creek like cold smoke, settling in doorways and on porches until whispers sounded like the town's steady breath. People at the general store paused mid-purchase to murmur the latest. Elias kept the fat girl. The phrase moved from mouth to mouth until repetition gave it weight, as if saying something often enough might shape it into truth. Clara became less a neighbor than a story wrapped in other people's sharpness. Where she had once moved through ordinary routines, stairs tracked her and children pointed with curiosity that felt like small knives. One brittle morning 3 of those girls walked down the lane, skirts pressed neat, smiles rehearsed, steps timed to make malice look effortless. They arrived at the barn where Clara labored, dust streaking her cheek from sweat and the day's work. Their amusement skimmed the rafters like a loose board. One called out loud enough for the horses to flinch. "Keeping company with a man who hires jokes," she said, voice sugar-coated and cruel. The wind took the phrase and scattered it, and straw chased the syllables across the yard. Cold bit through collars and stole steady breaths, making answers sound brittle if spoken at all. Gusts spun hay into small eddies and caught the hem of skirts, turning the moment sharp. Clara's cheeks burned with a heat that had nothing to do with exertion. She kept working because motion steadied her. Her hands learned focus while her heart managed humiliation. Motion became a kind of armor, and the barn's shelter felt like a battered refuge. Elias advanced with a gait that shifted the air. He did not call out with grand fury nor cast them off with loud scorn. Instead his voice dropped into a tone that ended the argument. "Leave. Now." The words were steady and exact, carrying the authority of someone who saved breath for necessary things. The girls scattered like startled birds, their skirts fluttering back up the lane as they laughed, their voices petering out. Dust spun where they had stood, and silence settled heavy enough to sting. That rebuke did not erase the hurt. Shame is cumulative, a slow accretion of moments that press like stone. Clara pressed her palm to the milled wood of a stall as if to anchor herself, and the barn's hush wrapped around her like a cloak. Elias watched without fuss, returning to his work with the unceremonious attention of a man for whom protection is habit rather than performance. There was no syrupy consolation, only practical steadiness that felt, in its way, like assurance. Pieces of Elias's past surfaced in small gestures and trimmed comments. While tightening a brace, his fingers lingered on a nail, and his jaw tightened as if he were touching a memory. He had been raised where temper weighed like currency, where a father's hand taught silence as safety. When he spoke of those years he did so in clipped sentences like facts read aloud, a childhood ordered by fear, a parent whose measures were precise and often brutal. Those memories shaped a man who met the world with a guarded reserve. Clara listened and found an odd recognition in his tale. Her own life bore its share of quiet cruelties, jeers at supper, cold shoulders in parlors, nights spent counting the echo of other people's laughter. Their suffering followed similar lines, though the reasons diverged, his shaped by blunt authority, hers by petty cruelty. Recognition did not leap into intimacy, it settled into something subtler, a sense that 2 solitary people carried wounds that might in time be tended together. Later that afternoon the boarding house matron arrived at the gate, ledger in hand and a voice sharpened by rent tallies and habitual judgment. She demanded Clara return, arguing that prior arrangements and rents could reclaim a person's place the way unpaid coin reclaimed. Elias's response was immovable and straightforward. "She stays." His stance shifted the axis of town chatter. Rumor faltered when faced with quiet facts. Neighbors peered through curtains to witness the exchange. The matron's anger flared and then collapsed into a huff less potent than she had hoped. Even after that small victory, Clara felt the sting of exposure in private moments when certain eyes found her. Shame is not a single event, but a map of old bruises, and the town had long grasping hands. Yet the barn's ledger order restored, tools hung in proper rows, a loft ladder aligned began to speak louder than a whisper. Those who had expected a spectacle started to notice practical details. A well-oiled hinge, a wheelbarrow freed from a tangle, and harnesses returned to their proper hooks. Everyday competence carried persuasive force in a place where talk often mattered more than truth. At dusk a few neighbors left awkward offerings on the porch, a sack of grain with no speech, a boy bringing a small bundle of nails with an honest shy face. These acts did not erase years of ridicule, but they laid the groundwork for a different pattern. Practical help in a small town can be more meaningful than clumsy apologies. Claire accepted these tokens with quiet gratitude, understanding that acceptance here would be earned slowly rather than gifted. Inside the barn, the wind calmed, and straw settled in lazy eddy. Clara slept beneath quilts that smelled faintly of sun and tack, and in the dim she turned the day's events over like coins in her palm. Elias's defense had not been performative. He had stood between her and the road's appetite for mockery without flourish. That lack of show made his protection feel truer, less staged and more an honest application of care learned from his own bruised past. Their unspoken connection grew incrementally. When Elias shared a fragment of childhood, how a father's temper had taught him to hide softer inclinations, Clara found herself answering with a memory of nights when boarding-house laughter left her hollow. They traded fragments until trust gathered like slow glue. None of it erased the town's cruelty, but it altered how that cruelty landed. It lost some of its immediate force when met by steady daily order. By morning the rumor still lingered in pockets of the town, but its bark had dulled. The barn's tidy proof made a quieter noise, dependable, practical, harder to dismiss. Clara continued her work, each sweep of the broom erasing a line in the old story and rewriting it into a ledger of competence. The town would always find something to say, but among oiled hinges and straightened rows, labor began to outpace rumor. Clara gathered small certainties like careful coins, a meal left at the step without comment, a warm cup set by the doorway, an offhand remark from Elias that acknowledged rather than judged. Those tiny mercies accumulated into a sturdier shape than any gossip. In private she imagined responses she did not have to deliver. Public proof replaced imagined defenses. Dust settled into patterns that made sense, and the barn became a ledger where deeds outweighed words. She learned that small steady acts could rewrite the town's story. With each honest day, she built a life measured by work and simple kindness, not by other people's cruel gossip and patience. They worked together beneath a low winter sun, stacking hay bales, until the barn's center resembled a small, ordered town of straw. Shoulders brushed in rhythm, an accidental punctuation that tightened something quiet between them. Each bale required two bodies to lift, shift and settle. Their movements synchronized without fanfare, an unspoken choreography learned in the space where necessity met stubborn will. Sweat cooled on skin as wind threaded through open slats, carrying smells of oil, earth and old grass, and the barn answered with the honest clatter of tools and the soft whicker of a mare turning in her stall. Clara's arms burned in a new register, not humiliation's tightness, but the honest ache of labor performed well. She found concentration in exertion. Each careful placement rewrote a small part of herself. Elias worked with an economy that measured value by results. He steadied a stack, braced a post, and when needed his hands guided rather than commanded. In the intervals carved out by work he shared a few things about his life, measured in facts: a father who taught fear in heavy-handed lessons, a childhood shaped by a man's anger that meant survival required making oneself small or invisible. He did not dramatize sorrow, he named it plainly. Clara listened, broom propped against a beam, and in the listening something loosened, a shared recognition that both carried scars shaped by other people's need to be right at another's expense. When she spoke, her confession arrived like a carefully folded paper that had finally been opened. She described the boarding house's laughter, the way it pushed at her ribcage until her breath came in thin gasps. She recited small humiliations, pinched jokes during supper, whispered nicknames tossed like scraps from a table, and admitted how those slights had taught her to shrink into the most miniature version of herself. Saying it aloud made the shame tangible, and in the barn's measured space, it was less able to hide behind other people's mouths. Elias heard without interruption, and his attention itself felt like currency. They moved from heavy bales to smaller tasks without noticing a break in their companionable cadence. Clara mended a frayed rope while Elias oiled a stubborn hinge. They traded stories that were not demands but invitations. He described learning patience with horses that tested him. She told of nights sewing patches by lamplight to keep shirts whole for another day. Those domestic admissions knitted them into a private map of mutual recognition. The barn became an unlikely confessional where honesty fit into work-sized moments. At one point their shoulders brushed while settling a tall stack. The contact lasted less than a heartbeat, but left a warmth that did not need naming. Elias shifted and in a voice devoid of flourish yet heavy with intention, said, "You're more than their word." The sentence arrived both as a verdict and a benediction. and it landed with a gravity that unfastened something in Clara's chest. For the first time since the notice had been pinned to the boarding house board, she felt the possibility that reputation could be rewritten by steady action rather than rumor. Those words did not erase the past, but offered a margin where new things might grow. The barn itself had transformed visibly. Aisles were cleared, feed was stacked, and tools were returned to their hooks where they belonged. The loft ladder, once a hazard, now leans accurately and safely. Each improvement was not only registered in the space, but also in Clara's sense of measurement. Tangible order became a ledger she could read. Where gossip had been an argument she could not win, the barn offered facts she could produce with her hand. She began to assemble a private proof against the town's narrative. A row of neat bales, a coiled rope, a quiet shelf where halters lay aligned. Light slid through cracks as afternoon waned, turning dust motes into slow constellations. They paused beside a stack to drink water from a tin cup and let the quiet settle between them, the barn's hum providing a kind of sanction for the intimacy of public labor. Conversation thinned into companionable silence, where each breathed in the same rhythm. Around them the farm exhaled small noises, wings, hooves, the distant clink of a harness, and those sounds wove into the day's catalogue of achievement. Clara felt the change inside as small accumulative increments rather than sudden epiphanies. The sting from boarding house laughs softened like frost under the sun. A tentative confidence grew from the habit of competence. She imagined mornings unshadowed by anticipatory dread and nights unspooled without rehearsed humiliation. Elias noticed these shifts without ceremony. His acknowledgement was practical rather than performative. He leaned against a post and adjusted a strap with the economy of someone who trusts action more than words. They traded details of survival that were oddly tender. She explained how she once hidden a sewn name in a shirt's hem to keep identity from being lost in laundries. He described teaching himself to sleep with one ear alert because a hardship had taught him that vigilance could be a kind of mercy. Those small disclosures bound them in the quiet way of people who have learned to offer shelter without spectacle. In that process the barn became less a workplace than a place of mutual tension. At twilight a subtle tension hovered, exertion's honest fatigue mingled with the memory of townsfolk's sharp tongues. But the day's ledger eased its bite. Outside a few neighbors left tokens at the gate without fanfare. A sack of grain, a boy's bundle of nails, offerings meant not to shame but to help. Those gestures did not undo years of ridicule, but they made an alternate economy possible. Practical kindness became a scaffold for trust to climb upon. Clara set the final bale and stepped back to appraise what they had accomplished. The transformation was visible and measurable. She inhaled the warm scent of sunlit hay and let it settle like a treaty inside her. Then directly, she spoke a prompt meant for others as much as for herself. Ever found hope in someone's quiet support? Tell us in the comments. The words invited listeners to share small salvations because this day had taught her that quiet backing sometimes mattered more than grand declarations. They finished the last tasks with steady hands. Their fingers met over the same knot and lingered for a single unremarkable instant. Nothing melodramatic occurred, no proclamations, no vows, but the moment contained a new kind of solidarity. Night arrived crisp and clear, stars pricking through cold air that smelled faintly of straw and oil. Clara wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and let the barn's ordered rhythm hold her. Elias placed a lantern nearby and sat across on a bale. The glow was soft and companionable, supplying light without demand. Before sleep she thought of the boarding house and contrasted the thinness of that life with the barn's substantiality. Each bale, each tightened strap, each hinge oiled became evidence she could hold to counteract rumor. She did not seek spectacle or public conversion. She wanted simple sufficiency, a bowl of stew without commentary, a bed that did not come with barbs, a place measured by honest work. Elias's earlier phrase had permitted him to want those modest things. The ledger of the day mattered more than any gossip. Clara tucked those entries into herself like careful coins. Each one a small testimony, steady labor, earned respect, a hand offered without fanfare. Outside the town might still murmur, but inside the barn a different story recorded itself. One of work, mutual recognition, and the subtle care that grows from shared struggle. They rested there, counting quiet victories beneath an honest, forgiving sky. 4 riders came up the lane, boots kicking up dust and laughter like loose stones. Their voices calibrated to wound. They eyed Clara with a recklessness that mistook cruelty for sport, trading jokes about a woman's shape as if weight could erase labor. One leaned forward and allowed a cruel quip to hang in the yard. Another let his grin sharpen the barb and gauge reaction. They intended spectacle and expected the porch to supply humiliation. Elias stepped out without drama, the kind of man whose quiet occupies space more effectively than noise. He planted himself between the riders and the porch as if placing a plank across a gap, and his presence rewired the moment. The nearest rider tried to press on with sarcastic babble, but the air had changed. Elias's steadiness did what swagger could not. He did not shout or strike. He offered a single-bound answer that closed the argument with little fuss. "She works harder than you," he said, voice low and sure. That sentence cut through the performative bravado. The saloon men blinked as if pretending not to hear, then tried to salvage swagger with thinner jibes. Their laughs came smaller, their reins looser. Energy leached out of their postures. One muttered about town talk, another made a half-hearted boast and rode off with a swagger that no longer felt convincing. Hooves faded down the road and the yard exhaled as if a tide had pulled back. Clara watched the exchange from the porch rail, palms warm from earlier work, eyes slick with the residue of moist dust. She had been braced for spectacle that would mark her and stick, yet the defense she saw was simple and precise. Elias did not perform heroism, he rebalanced the stakes by naming the truth. That naming transformed the ledger of her day, where gossip recorded only rumor. The barn's truth showed what labor had earned. She felt something in her chest loosen under that practical accounting. Orange light poured over fences and hay, bathing the scene in a hush that made even sharp words seem petty. Dusk softened edges and gilded small things until the yard looked less like a place of judgment and more like a studio of honest toil. The sky's glow turned the rider's retreat into an ordinary event rather than a defeat. The sight of Elias framed against that light read as more than posture. It read as a promise that quiet standards could be sufficient resist. Neighbors slowed their steps to watch and readjusted their impressions. People in small towns note who stands where and how. A man defending another by action rather than gossip causes reputations to shift subtly. The barn's visible order, neat bales hung tack, a steady ladder began to speak louder than idle talk. Those who listened with the patience of routine recognized competence. Rumor's appeal diminished in the face of practicality. Gratitude rose quietly within Clara, practical rather than theatrical. She thought of the hours she had spent stacking and sweeping and of the small evidence of order she had created. Elias's remark converted those hours into a public ledger, others could read without indulgence. The porch felt steadier beneath her, and the night less likely to fold prospect into shame. Elias flicked a glance that involved no flourish. His attention returned to sheltering routines, checking a latch, moving a lantern nearer the door. His care took the shape of necessary things, not declarations, and in that shape was reassurance. He would not parade defense as a display, instead he preferred to cover needs so that little provocation could take root. Clara realized loyalty could be mundane and complete. They did not exchange many words afterward. The day's proof had spoken for itself. The porch offered a space where privacy and community touched, and they let that border hold them. A distant dog barked and then went quiet as neighbors resumed their own rhythm. The saloon men became a memory whose edges softened with the passage of time. Night deepened and stars appeared like small honest lights. Clara felt exhaustion in her limbs and a new steadiness in her chest. She wrapped a shawl more tightly and watched Elias move with the same economy that had reshaped the evening. He placed a lantern on the step and sat on a bale a little away from her, not to claim space but to share it. The lamplight pooled between them as if to keep witness to the evening's small justice. Practical kindness accumulated that night. A neighbor left a small bundle of wood at the gate, another set a bowl of stew near the door. These acts did not erase old slights but built scaffolding for a gentler pattern. The barn's ledger continued to outpace rumor because work records themselves, where gossip depends on appetite. Clara let herself relax into that fact. The rider's departure felt less like triumph and more like a scene closing without consequence. The town would talk as towns do, but under the porch light a different narrative had begun. One measured by labor and upheld by someone unwilling to trade dignity for sport. That realization sat in her like a quiet coin, enough to buy small comforts. Inside the barn the sensible noises resumed, the creak of a beam settling, hay shifting under the weight of stored sunlight. Elias moved from task to task with practical steps, and Clara watched each motion as evidence of how constancy looks in a single life. She admired not a theatrical defender but a man who chose to keep ordinary obligations steady, and in doing so protected what mattered. When the first stars freckled the sky, Clara found herself smiling in a way that was not bravado nor performance, but relief. The sting of other people's words would not vanish overnight, but proof had been made: a day's labor, a man's plain words, a barn that testified. She folded her hands on her knees and let the quiet settle, knowing the ledger on the porch would hold weight against rumor. Elias's final words that night were sparse, offering neither sermon nor claim. "Let them talk," he said again, softer now. The phrase carried with it the authority of someone who had seen gossip cycles and chosen not to feed them. For Clara it felt like permission to exist without constant apology, and permission to let work and care define her play. The riders had come looking for spectacle. They left having only been a small gust against a steadier weather. She rose slowly and closed the barn door with care, the latch falling into place with a satisfying clunk that sounded like closure. The night carried on with its ordinary music. A lantern's glow traced well-worn paths, and the barn settled under a blanket of quiet. Clara breathed and felt steadier, wrapped in the practical continuity of chores and the small gestures that made shelter true. Tomorrow would bring more work, perhaps more whispers, but she had acquired something sturdier than rumor, the measured tally of honest days, and a man whose quiet defense had become her shelter. Clara left the boarding house with a satchel and the 2 faded letters she had kept like anchors. The room Elias offered smelled of straw and oil, and its single window framed a slice of sky indifferent to rumor. She moved in quietly, laying plates wrapped in cloth on a plain table. The mattress was narrow but warmed by afternoon sun, and for the first time in months she slept without rehearsing insults. Mornings at the ranch changed shape once she settled. Dawn arrived with practical tasks. Ropes needed fresh knots and blankets required tucking to keep out drafts. Elias measured work by results rather than gossip. Each morning Clara learned which tools to use and how to steady a ladder. She discovered a rhythm where labor answered need, not malice. One afternoon a saddle came apart. The leather cracked and the seams frayed. Elias spread the pieces on a bench and set out tools with calm precision. He worked like a man who treated mending as a ritual, burnishing edges, selecting waxed thread, stretching leather until it trusted the stitch. Clara sat beside him and learned quickly, matching his steady hands with her own. Stitch by stitch the saddle regained shape, and with it a quiet competence in her fingers. As they worked, Elias spoke in the spare way he reserved for facts. "I kept people at arm's length," he said. "My father measured affection by force. He did not ask for pity." His words were practical, like a tool placed on the bench. Clara listened and felt a sense of recognition more than surprise. Her life had its ledger of small cruelties too. Boarding house jokes, nicknames that stuck like burrs, nights when laughter followed her home. Naming those things made them less sharp. Their confessions did not produce sudden intimacy. Instead, honesty is threaded into routine. The barn, the room, and the workbench became places where care was offered in small acts. Handing a cup, sliding a blanket, setting a lantern nearby. Trust arrived as a sequence of dependable gestures. When Elias paused and said, "You're more than their words," the phrase carried weight because it came from habit and evidence. One crisp morning Elias took a pair of gloves from a peg and held them out. The leather was worn but whole. He offered them without flourish and Clara accepted with both hands. The gloves protected her palms from splinters and friction, and their utility felt like a quiet kindness. Wearing them she worked with fewer pinpricks, and the simple comfort allowed her to focus on her technique rather than the pain. Meals became times for quiet exchange rather than performance. They ate stews at a plain table and traded small stories. Elias teaching a mare to accept a bridle, Clara learning to patch shirts so their hems would last. These small anecdotes accumulated into a private history. Neither sought spectacle, both valued steady presence. Neighbors began leaving modest offerings without fanfare. A bundle of kindling, a basket of eggs. Such gestures did not erase past ridicule, but made daily life easier. Elias rarely praised extravagantly. Instead, he acknowledged work with practical measures. A tightened strap, a well-set harness. Those actions built trust more effectively than any speech could have. Clara slept more easily, and woke without the tight dread she had long carried. Keeping her simple room tidy became an act of self-respect. Arranging tools and blankets taught her care that extended beyond chores. Elias's presence was not a cure, but a companionable steadiness. A man whose reliability felt like shelter. One evening as the sun turned the yard to soft gold, They paused in their tasks and watched the horses shift in their stall. Elias handed her a strap to inspect. Their fingers brushed and he allowed a small rare smile. The moment passed quietly but reassured both of them more than any grand declaration could. Clara felt recognized rather than sized up. And that recognition warmed something cautious inside her. Before sleep she rehearsed new measures by which she judged herself. Steady work over performative perfection, usefulness over rumor. The barn and the repaired saddle encoded a practical belonging. To belong here meant contributing, being needed and being acknowledged without spectacle. The CTA rose like a gentle question. Ever found a place that felt like home? Share below. The thought was not rhetorical. It invited others into the private ledger she was building. Provisions left at the gate were accepted with simple thanks. A neighbor setting down a wrapped loaf would nod and leave. On afternoons Elias taught Clara to read a horse's breath, how a softened flank meant trust, and how patience with animals translated into patience with people. He showed her how to tamp packing so a saddle would not slip and how a quiet voice steadied a restless mare. These lessons moved beyond technique into a calm way of being. They mended more than leather. A loose hinge once let wind finger the barn, so they removed the old pin, scrubbed the metal until it shone faintly, oiled the joint and drove a fresh pin that held for seasons. Minor repairs prevented larger breakdowns, and each success rewrote Clara's internal ledger. When rain threatened, they worked in tandem, pulling tarps, securing bales, shifting feed, and cooperation became evidence that her presence mattered. Elias did not offer apologies for his past. He made room for the present. He placed his hand on the bench, a steady presence requiring no speech. Clara learned to distinguish between compassion that was merely performed and genuine compassion. Rising without the tightness shaped by mockery felt less like a miracle and more like a reward for practice. The boarding house's laughter lost grip when matched against visible order. Occasional disagreements nodding one way, tension on a girth, produced solutions rather than estrangement. Corrections held respect. They adapted without diminishing the other. These adjustments built trust. Collaboration altered practice without erasing dignity. As the season turned, villagers recalculated assumptions. Whispers persisted, yet fewer voices lined up to throw barbs. People who had expected a spectacle now observed work being completed and adjusted their impression. Clara kept a private list of victories. A repaired saddle ready for a season, a harness adjusted to spare a flank, a row of tools hung straight. Those records mattered more than public approval. One night Elias left a lantern on her table and closed the door softly. The gesture added to an accumulating architecture of care. In the morning she slid on the gloves he had given her and fed the horses with a steadier hand. The CTA she later voiced became an invitation rather than a plea. Ever found a place that felt like home? Share below. The barn had become proof, and belonging felt like a practice earned through patience and shared labor. The matron arrived in a furrow of disapproval, ledger under arm and two girls in tow whose smiles carried the sharpness of rehearsal. They marched into the yard as if pursuing ordnance rather than a person, voices precise and ready to tally wrongs. Clara braced with a practiced stillness. Hours of labor had taught her how to steady breathing and frame replies in small, useful sentences. The matron demanded restitution, citing bed rent and house rules as if ownership could be enforced like law. Elias listened without spectacle, his posture a quiet declaration that this argument would not be settled with theater. Clara felt a strange lightness when she heard him say with none of the town's fevered outrage, "She stays." The boarding house's authority had once seemed absolute, bolstered by rumor and small cruelties. Here authority took a different form, practical, anchored in mutual obligation. She answered with a clarity that had been forged by days of steady work. "I choose to remain." The phrase carried no plea, only the evidence of labor. The neat bales, the orderly tools, the room she now kept true. The matron sputtered, flapped her ledger as if ink could strike a person down, and then retreated with a dignity that felt brittle. After she left muttering, ordinary sounds returned. The creak of a gate, a horse's slow breath, the wind stirring straw in low eddies. Elias checked a hinge while Clara stacked the final bales. Their actions read like a partnership achieved through continued effort rather than rescue. Dawn eased into a gray wash that softened edges and steadied color, making newly stacked hay glint faintly as if promising continuity. This modest morning felt like the beginning of a life assembled without spectacle. a slow architecture made of service and small mercy. Neighbors began to show quiet proofs of regard. A pot of stew left on the step without fanfare, a bundle of wood propped by the gate, a child depositing eggs with a shy nod. These tokens mattered because they were ordinary, woven into daily routines instead of offered for applause. Their accumulation shifted the town's appetite away from scandal toward usefulness. Clara logged each act inwardly, adding small credits to a private ledger that strengthened her claim to place. Inside the barn the work continued and the world was ordered. Bales were stacked true, tools were returned to their hooks, and animals were tended with steady hand. The tidy record of labor outpaced rumor. Competence proved persuasive in a community that prized visible contribution. Clara's shoulders relaxed as anticipatory dread gave way to practical confidence. She planned modest securities, sturdier shirts, a locked chest for savings and skills to mend harnesses, and set to work on them with patient hand. Elias sustained protection through habit rather than display, checking latches, tightening straps, and setting items where they would be found. Those repeated acts built a scaffold around Clara that relied on persistence more than pronouncement. One frost-thin morning he handed her a pair of gloves without ceremony. The simple utility eased chores and implied a steadier kind of care. As the weeks passed, the town's appetite for gossip waned in the face of repeated evidence. A farmer praised a repaired harness instead of trading a tale, and a child who had once pointed now watched quietly as harnesses hung straight. Proof, not argument, shifted attention. The barn's visible order reframed conversation. Clara used that shift to make practical plans. Stitch stronger seams, stash coins in a small chest at the ranch, learn to splice rope cleanly. Elias supported these moves with modest gifts: a spool of strong thread, an extra nail, and by leaving tools and instruction within reach. When she finally said in public, "I choose to stay," her voice was steady and the remark landed as a fact rather than a flourish. The matron's sharpness lost its purchase against routine, and the gray dawns felt less like limbo and more like scaffold. Ordinary kindnesses continued: a pot of stew at the step, a bundle of kindling by the gate, a shy delivery of eggs, practical endorsements that accumulated into a durable network of support. In the barn, daily order was maintained. Bales were stacked correctly, tools were rested where they would be found, and animals were adjusted to patient care. The tidy ledger of work outpaced rumor and made spectacle unnecessary. Clara and Elias repaired what needed mending and learned a language of shared labor. Trust accumulated like dust on rafters, subtle and pervasive. Their bond resembled a well-oiled hinge, useful, steady, unadorned, and it proved sufficient against the town's appetite for drama. In quiet moments, Elias offered small, sustaining gestures that asked for no repayment: a lantern placed within reach, a chest set out for her savings, a spool of thread left on the bed. These acts taught Clara that standing for herself required construction as much as assertion. To show up, do the work, accrue daily evidence. On a pale morning they stood side by side on the porch, their palms roughened by chores, watching the light move across the yard. Silence settled like a cloth, and she felt the solidity of someone who had chosen shelter and then built a life to sustain it. Ever stood up for what you want? Tell us in the comments. Elias waited until dawn after a week of steady labor. When the sky softened to gold and the barn stood tidy from hands that no longer trembled. He had never favored grand displays. His life was marked by minor duties and careful tasks, and in that steady routine, he found truth. Clara stood on the porch, breath a pale ribbon, eyes still rimmed by tears and the residue of work. Around them, the farm kept ordinary sounds: a mare shifting in her stall, the creak of a gate, a rooster's distant call. In that hush, Elias took her hand with the same practical care he applied to tools, his fingers meeting the rough skin that spoke of unearthed strength. For a long moment, no one spoke. The barn's ordered spaces and morning's hush did the talking on their behalf. Then Elias drew a breath and spoke with a softness that carried no command yet held certainty. "Not as a worker," he said, voice steady against the thin air, "as my wife." The words landed like a small stone into still water. Their ripples touched everything around them. Accepting him felt less like surrender and more like an affirmation. She offered the simplest assent and let the future fold gently around that choice. The town, ever swift with rumor, transmitted the news at market and at the smithy and in the general store's doorway. Neighbors murmured surprise, some threaded it with scorn, others with curiosity, and a few with the quiet approval that translated into useful deeds. Bread on the step, a bundle of kindling, a spool of thread left without fanfare. But on the porch, there was no need for public endorsement. What had already been decided by steady acts needed no performance. The moment belonged to them and to the work that had brought them there. They married in the way that suited them, brief and exact, witnessed by a handful of neighbors who offered practical blessings rather than spectacle. Gifts were sensible: a carved spoon, a length of strong rope, a woven cloth. The ceremony required few words. The barn's rafters held dust motes that glittered like benediction as they stood side by side. Doing things together proved its own kind of promise, and the couple returned to the daily chores that slowly reshaped public opinion. A fence repaired before winter, a mare tended through a freeze, a stubborn gate reset. These acts spoke louder than rumor. People who had once whispered left offerings at the gate and accepted a curt thank you in return. The boarding house's jeers lost purchase as competence accumulated into proof. Intimacy grew in practical increments. Their hands met often over knots and straps, over reins and bales, and those touches acquired new meaning. Elias offered small protections without display: a lantern placed near her bed, a tin cup set within reach, and gloves hung on a peg. Clara accepted such care as a language of steadiness rather than pity. She began to sleep with less dread and woke with a steadier step. When a neighbor's wagon broke at the lane's turn, Elias and Clara repaired the wheel together. The work itself taught people a new grammar for judging character. Children who once stared now tipped hats with a shy familiarity. Market talk shifted toward seeds and weather, rather than scandal, because evidence carried weight and needs required a response. At times tenderness surprised them both in ordinary forms: a hand at the small of her back when passing through a crowded doorway, a cup warmed before cold hands reached for it, a quiet word dropped in the dark to steady sleep. These small rituals, set down like stitches, made a life of modest durability. Clara kept the faded letters she had once hidden and read them now as markers of where she had been, not as anchors holding her back. Elias learned to lower his guard because persistent kindness loosened old reflexes. A man who had once measured affection by force discovered repeated gentle acts could reform that habit. Harvest marked their month. They stood on the porch at dawn and watched the sun turn fields to metal and gold, hands linked and weathered. The barn had become home, a place that measured people by work rather than room. Neighbors adapted because needs were practical and help proved helpful. When someone required a hand, Clara and Elias were part of the network that answered. Their life did not erase every old pain, but it rerouted attention toward purpose and reliability. Small offerings arrived at the gate: a loaf, a bundle of wood, a child's shy gift of eggs. Each token reinforced a public record of mutual aid. Their partnership deepened through shared chores, cooperative problem-solving, and a comfort born of steady presence. When a gate splintered, they repaired it together. When a mare foaled, they tended through the night with quiet competence. Those episodes knit the community tighter and reframed the couple's story from scandal to example. Practical help spread: Elias teaching a boy to splice rope, Clara showing a neighbor how to mend harness leather, and goodwill multiplied because kindness in labor proved contagious. Over time, people stopped assigning sharp edges to their perceptions and began to treat the Thornton homestead as part of everyday infrastructure. Farmers who had joked now sought help without smirks. Apprentices came looking for instruction rather than scandal. Clara kept a small chest under her mattress, where she tucked coins and a token ribbon. Each deposit was a quiet triumph. Neighbors left tools and provisions without announcement and accepted a nod in return. The boarding house matron, brusque and economical with warmth, softened in ways too small for headline, an offhand nod in passing that signaled a shift. Clara and Elias belonged by construction rather than proclamation. Their lives were built from repeated, reliable work. In the weeks that followed, everyday tasks accumulated into evidence that reshaped the town's regard. Farmers who once traded jibes came seeking help with stubborn oxen and sagging fences. Neighbors left tools and provisions without announcement and accepted a nod in return. Clara kept a small chest under her bed where she tucked coins and a token ribbon. Each deposit felt like a quiet triumph. Elias taught a youngster to splice rope and showed a neighbor how to set a post. Actually, those acts multiplied goodwill more than gossip ever could. They staged no spectacle. Instead, they answered needs with practical care and steady hands. On market mornings, people spoke of the weather and seeds rather than scandal. and children ran through the yard with genuine abandon. The boarding house matron offered a curt nod in passing, a gesture that marked small change. Clara and Elias belonged by construction rather than proclamation. Their lives were assembled from repeated obligations that they kept faithfully. Their love, rooted in labor and quiet kindness, invited others to imagine a different way of valuing one another. Their peaceful life gained steady practical public approval. Clara and Elias turned a cruel joke into love. Where are you listening from? Drop your city below and share if their story hit you hard. Subscribe for more stories that'll keep you hooked.